Confident, confident, confident. I can be confident, 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 confident. I can be confident at work.
Hello and welcome to the Confident at Work podcast. I'm your host and your confidence coach, Anna Manning, and today we're talking about what to do if you get talked over, dismissed, or ignored. So this is a challenge that a lot of us face, but we often don't discuss. And it can happen in different professional settings, but the challenge is getting talked over, dismissed, or ignored. It's an uncomfortable experience and it can have a profound impact on your confidence and ultimately also on your performance and on your job satisfaction. So we're going to explore those moments. Think about why they happen and what you can do when they do, so that even if you are in an environment where you are getting talked over, dismissed, or ignored, you can maintain or even rebuild your confidence. So first, I want to say that from my conversations with people and from even looking at the research, I can see that this is a fairly common experience, especially in meetings or in other kinds of collaborative environments. Sometimes it's unintentional, maybe not always, but sometimes it is. And whether it is or it isn't, repeated occurrences of being talked over or dismissed or ignored, of course, can reinforce a feeling of invisibility and feed into self-doubt, self-criticism, and lower your self-confidence. It can make you detach, it can make you feel dismissed, and all with good reason, right? There is an emotional toll, especially if this happens repeatedly. Like, let's say in the course of your career, there was one time where you got dismissed or ignored or talked over. That's probably not going to bother you very much. But if it's bothering you, I'm guessing that either it's a repeated thing or for you, it really is part of a low confidence cycle. And it may be that it's part of a low confidence cycle because it's part of a repeated pattern of behavior that you have been subject to during your career. And of course, that emotional toll that it would take on you can create feelings of self doubt. It can reduce your willingness to contribute in the first place. And it can make you second guess your self worth and your ideas. Over time, if it's a repeating pattern, it totally will chip away at your confidence, especially if you're in an environment that doesn't acknowledge it or address it. So I just wanted to give you 3 examples to help you think about where and when this happens and how it might look. Because you might be listening to this episode and thinking, do you know, I don't think I've ever experienced that. And that's great. But there may be other individuals within your organization, within your meetings that are experiencing it. I'm hopeful that this podcast episode is going to be useful both for the person who is experiencing this, but also, even if you're not, for the person who might be watching other people experiencing it and maybe not even noticing. So my first example is around being interrupted. So let's say Teresa is speaking in a meeting, and before she can finish, someone cuts in and starts speaking over her. She goes quiet, they continue. She feels sidelined and frustrated. Now, I know that I can sometimes jump to get my point in, and I know that I have many times cut over people. I have to watch really carefully so that I don't do it. But if this is part of a repeating pattern, let's say this happens to Teresa in every single meeting she's in, of course she's going to feel a type of way about what is happening. Now, she may go to, this is a terrible environment, these people are incredibly rude, and continue to advocate for herself and make her point. She may do that, but that isn't always easy. That is a tough and tricky thing to do, especially if Teresa is noticing that she is the one that this is happening to, and maybe this isn't actually happening to everyone. And also, you can imagine that if this is happening to Teresa all the time, it could start to make her doubt herself, doubt her ideas, doubt her contribution, doubt her method of delivery. And I've heard this so many times with clients. They'll say to me, I'm not sure, I need help with how I'm delivering something. And when we dig into it, there's really no problem with how they're delivering it. but it may be the fact of who they are delivering it and other people's either rudeness at best or just unconscious bias at worst. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into this episode. So, another example is ideas being dismissed and then adopted later. So, let's say Amrit shares his idea and it's dismissed with a, oh no, that won't work. A couple of weeks later, he finds out that this idea is now being adopted without any recognition. I've coached clients on this loads of times, and I should imagine that is incredibly frustrating for somebody when they're not really acknowledged as being the person that introduced that idea. You don't get the recognition, you don't get the credit, but also I can imagine it's very sidelining and dismissive, especially when your idea proved to be a good one. And my third example is ideas getting ignored until they're rephrased by someone else. So let's say Miriam shares a suggestion in a senior level meeting and it gets ignored. 3 minutes later, a male colleague echoes the idea and suddenly it's praised and discussed. How do you think Miriam's going to feel in that instance? Well, we know, because this is a real example with a different name, that she felt invisible and undermined. So you may recognize some of those examples. You may think, gosh, that's happened to me. Or even if it hasn't happened to you, you may have noticed that it happens to other people. So let's take a minute to understand why this is happening. And let me say, if you are the person that this is happening to, you are not responsible for why this is happening. And you do not have to spend all your time and energy thinking about why this is happening. I just want to introduce this so that we're thinking properly about the wider context in the situation. Because what I often notice is that people will start to assume that the problem is them. Either their ideas, their contributions, their suggestions, the way they're putting something across. And if that's not landing or that's not being picked up or it's being routinely dismissed or ignored, then also the problem must be them. Well, often not the case. So we need to put this in its proper context. There are dynamics at play within organizations. Sometimes those dynamics are hierarchical. So there will be some organizations where if you're less senior, you may not get listened to, your ideas may not get recognized, you may get talked over, etc. That's one kind of dynamic that can be at play. There can be unconscious biases at play or even conscious biases at play. There may be gender biases. There may be racial biases. There may be age biases. There may be ableist biases and patterns that tend to favor certain voices in certain groups because of those biases. Now, there may be the people who are interrupting, speaking over, dismissing, or ignoring people's ideas, and they're doing it on purpose and they know they're doing it. That's one thing. And maybe there's particular ways of dealing with that. Some of the time, they're talking over people, dismissing them, interrupting them, or ignoring their ideas because of unintentional bias or unconscious bias, should we say. They have a bias, it's impacting their behavior, but they won't necessarily be conscious of that bias and its impact on their behavior. In this instance, interrupting, dismissing, ignoring, talking over. A few episodes ago, and if you haven't listened to it, scroll back and listen. I did a podcast episode called The Authority Gap: Why Women Are Still Taken Less Seriously Than Men and What We Can Do About It. And that was centered around a book, which is the culmination of the research of Marianne Sieghart, who wrote The Authority Gap and is a real authority on authority gap behavior. And one of the things that we talked about was the fact that women are more likely to be challenged than men. Women are more likely to be interrupted. Women are more likely to be talked over. And this is put down to unconscious gender bias. Now, Black and brown women, global majority women, are more likely, again, and this is in the UK, right? You might have to think about this from your particular context. But in the UK context, the further away you are from the white male middle class norm, quote unquote, the more likely you are to be subject to authority gap behavior. And that includes behaviors like being challenged more, being asked to justify yourself more, being talked over more, your ideas being subject to more scrutiny, being ignored more, being interrupted more. When you actually start looking at the data, it's frightening. And Marianne quoted some really interesting data that came from the US and Australian Supreme Court. So they looked at male and female justices. Now, in these contexts, you do not get any higher in terms of a level of seniority in the judiciary. And yet, they found in both cases that the women were subject to way more interruptions than the men were. Now, did those advocates know that they were subjecting the women to more interruptions? Probably not. I bet if you'd have asked them, they wouldn't have even recognized that's what they were doing, but they were doing it. And what Marianne Seacott said was she can only assume that if it's happening to that level of seniority, women of that level of seniority, that it must be happening all the way down through the ranks from the most senior to the less senior. And that makes sense. She talks a lot about how we can recognize these authority gaps created by gender, created by race, and other things too, and what we can do about them on a systemic level as well as an individual level. And today I'm going to be focused on that individual level because, yes, we need to recognize and change these systemic unconscious biases at a system level. But they live in our heads at an individual level. And you, my friend, who are listening to this podcast, are listening because this issue may be having an impact on you at an individual level. So today I really want to look at it through that lens for you so that you understand and you appreciate that broader context. Understand and appreciate that it probably has nothing to do with you as an individual. And we can think about how you might respond and react now you know that. So before we get onto some strategies, I just want to talk a little bit about what I've seen with the clients that I work with that can happen when you are subject to these kinds of interruptions, being talked over, being dismissed, being ignored. You can assume that it's a you problem. And this is where our brains, I would say, tend to go. So you can assume that you're getting dismissed, ignored, because there is some way in which you're doing something which isn't right. There is some way in which you're putting your point across that isn't right. There is something about your personality or the way that people are respecting you or not. And all of that you can internalize and think, it's me. And in the age old breakup line, I want to say to you, it's not you, it's me. And by me, I'm talking about the unconscious systemic bias that you may be subject to. It's not you, it's that. And when we put the proper responsibility in its place, yes, we may still think about how we want to command a room. We may still think about the how authoritative we want to be and how we want to make a point. Yes, we can still think about all that, but we have to think about it within its proper context. So instead of just assuming that it's you, and I can tell you that for the clients that I've worked with, most of the time we've uncovered it's not really them, it's what's going on around them. And they may need support to deal with that because it's not easy to deal with. So that's the first thing. It's not you. The second thing I've seen it doing to people, and this makes total sense, is they start to second guess their contributions. So they start to think, oh, maybe that isn't a good idea. Or maybe I did put that across wrong. Or maybe I'm just not very good at coming up with strategic level thinking or whatever it is. When people start to second guess their ideas, two things can happen. Either they stay quiet and they don't even share those ideas at all because they're so in their head and second guessing that they think, maybe I shouldn't or I can't really share that. Or they can put their idea out there still, but they may be more hesitant. They may feel less confident. And again, that is going to have an impact. The third thing that I see is it can lead people to doubt themselves more generally. So they'll start to doubt wider than just in this setting and say, well, maybe, I'm not really cut out to do this job. Maybe I shouldn't really be here. Maybe it's my level of expertise, which is being questioned every time I'm being challenged or talked over. Maybe people don't really believe in me and that's why this is happening. So maybe I really shouldn't be in this job. And can you see how just from this, I say just, it's important, but just from this one issue of being talked over or being ignored or being disregarded, it can spin out and we can assume that it's because of a wider issue with us. or with our work or with our expertise or with our ability to do the job. It may mean none of those things. Again, it may just be someone's rudeness and or their unconscious bias. The next thing that I've seen it can lead to is that people start to, with this cycle of doubt and being unsure, they then may start to criticize themselves. You then may start to question exactly how you said something and was it right and did it land, and become hyper vigilant and comb over every little thing, every word, every idea, every suggestion, and then criticize yourself if it hasn't been perfect. Or it may still have been a really great contribution, but if somebody talked over it, you may think, well, it just wasn't good enough, or I didn't say it right. The voice in your head can join those legions of other people who are then dismissing you and ignoring you and talking over you. And your voice in your head can start to do that for you. It can start to dismiss you and your ideas. It can start to talk over you while you're thinking about sharing, or during while you're sharing, or it can dismiss you afterwards and put you through the ringer and make you think, gosh, maybe that wasn't right, or maybe I shouldn't have said it like that. It can force you to give up and disconnect. And I've heard this from clients before where they get so fed up of this kind of behavior that they just think, what is the point? Why would I even share this idea with them? Because they're going to ignore me, they're going to talk over me, they're going to dismiss me. And 5 minutes later, someone else is going to pick it up and they're all going to think it was great. Imagine someone sitting in that environment that thinks, what is the point? Well, you can see them. I'd be with them. Yeah, I would think, what is the point? What is the point if you're going to get talked over or dismissed, or your ideas are just going to get picked up and then everyone else is going to get the praise for them? That could really make you feel like you just really don't want to contribute that much anymore. And I think anybody could understand that. The last thing before we get to those strategies is that it can reinforce a low confidence cycle. So if you've listened to the podcast before, you'll have heard me talk about this low confidence cycle. And I'm going to leave a link in the show notes so that you can have a look at the low confidence cycle and see for you whether this is creating or reinforcing a low confidence cycle. Because once you're in that cycle, which includes self criticism, self doubt, setting very high standards which are unrealistic, failing to tolerate any mistakes, and noticing negatives, not positives, and never really giving yourself any good feedback. Once you're in that cycle, any behaviors like this that you're subject to are just going to reinforce that low confidence cycle and keep it in place. So that all might sound a bit like doom and gloom, right? But there are strategies that you can adopt. There are things you can do which will help you. And I've got 5, but you may have more ideas while you're listening to this. Things may pop up in your head, and they'll probably be the best ideas. So I encourage you to go with those too. But the first one is a reframe and re-enter. So if you can, and you may have to steel yourself, you may have to be brave, but if you can you re-enter the conversation after your idea has been dismissed, you've been talked over, you've been interrupted? You could use a stock phrase like, as I was saying, or I'd like to finish my point. So you can notice that this behavior has happened, and maybe instead of letting the retreat happen, maybe you can think, well, actually, I could re-enter this conversation, and there you go. As I was saying, I'd like to finish my point. Paul, I haven't finished. Can you wait a moment while I continue? Right? You may have even heard people do this, and there may be a stock phrase that you can just pull out of the bag at that moment to allow you to continue. The next thing you can do is bring back the idea. So if one of your ideas gets traction after somebody else has repeated it, remind the group subtly but clearly. For instance, you could say, I'm glad you're seeing the potential in that idea I mentioned earlier. I'm happy to build on it further, and then build. The next idea, the next strategy is to engage an ally. So maybe you're routinely in a board meeting, and it's that meeting where you notice this is happening. Could you engage somebody else who's often also in that meeting? If you can, those people might be able to support you, and you might be able to support them by amplifying contributions. It also might help you to know that you've got an ally in that meeting who's hearing you, who's seeing you, and who's also noticing what's happening. This is not a nice thing to be alone with. So if there's anybody you trust who you can bring in, great. In that podcast episode with Marianne Seacart, we talked about how women in Barack Obama's inner circle started doing this. They realized they weren't getting as much traction as the men were. So they got together, I think it was 3 of them, and she'd interviewed them. And they talked about how they made this strategy where they were going to amplify each other's points and keep bringing them back. And they did. And they started to get more traction. And Barack Obama actually noticed that they were doing this and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And they said to him, "We're not getting as much traction as the men are. So we've got this strategy to amplify each other's points. And so far it's working." So comes right from the top. See if you can engage an ally. There may be a moment where this next strategy is appropriate, and that's to directly address potential bias. So you might want to speak with a manager or a trusted colleague and highlight in a constructive way the trend that you've noticed. You might want to suggest how essential it is to cultivate a space where contributions are equally recognized. And if you need any data to back this up, there is loads online, but also go to that book, The Authority Gap, that I already talked about, because there are scores of it in there. Maybe you can start a wider conversation around bias, around interruptions, around being talked over, or ideas being dismissed, especially against particular groups. Maybe that widening of participation around this idea could support you and other people. And ultimately, of course, it supports your organization. Because if you're sitting there with your great ideas and good contributions, which are being dismissed, ignored, or talked over, that is not in the best interest of your organization or your clients or the people that you serve. Of course, it isn't. You've got good stuff to say. You have stuff to contribute. We want to hear from you. And your organization should, please God, want to hear from you too. And if there is something, a systemic factor like this, which is getting in the way of you being heard, maybe you can bring that to the organization and see what people say. Depends what kind of organization you're in, of course. Maybe there is a diversity and inclusion group. Maybe there is a gender group. Maybe you have the voice of a director or the CEO, and you can have those conversations with them. Maybe you are a director or a CEO, and you can start to recognize, is this happening in my organization? If you start to ask people, they may tell you, yes, this is happening and it happens to me. And then you can think about what you do about it as an organization together. The last strategy that I want to give you is one that I discussed with somebody this week who told me in email that this is a real problem for them. There were very specific scenarios where this was happening to her. And I said, okay, could you make a plan? So let's say there's 5 instances where you know this is happening, like you get interrupted or you get talked over or your idea gets dismissed or it feels like people aren't taking you seriously. Make a plan that says, if X happens, then I will do Y. So this is not her example, but let's say I'm in a particular meeting and I make a point around a particular issue which I see happening regularly. And everyone's like, yeah, and then moves on. I get to decide ahead of time and have a little think about what I'm going to do if they dismiss me on that point again. So instead of leaving it to the moment when I'm in that meeting and I'm getting dismissed, I've thought about it ahead of time and I've made a plan for what I'm going to do if I get dismissed again. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't get dismissed, but at least it gives me or it gives you the opportunity to have thought ahead of time how you want to handle it. It makes it easier in the moment to handle it if you don't have to scrabble around thinking in that moment how you're going to handle it. If you already know you've made a plan, that doesn't mean that it may be perfectly executed every time. It may not, and it may be hard, but at least it gives you a fighting chance. So if there are routine places or instances where you're getting interrupted, talked over, dismissed, then make this plan. If X, then I will do Y. And the last thing is, if you really need some help with this, then get help. Get help from your manager, ask them for some coaching support. Don't think that you necessarily have to do all this on your own. There may be support out there for you. I may be able to support you. So think wider. If this is not a you issue and this is a systemic issue, which you're going to have to face and overcome in order to succeed in your career, in order to be confident, in order to put across the ideas and suggestions, in order to do your job effectively, you need support to do that, then ask for support to do that. The worst they can say is no. So I just want to think, and we've already touched on this, but what the role of organizations and leaders is in this. And if you're a leader or you're in charge of an organization, then I hope you've been thinking about whether or not this may be an issue within your organization. And it's very easy to find out. Just start asking a few people and they will tell you. And once you know, you maybe are able to do something about it. If you're chairing a meeting, you might be the one to really notice if this is happening. Where and when is it happening? And how can you redirect in your role as chair? How can you say, Rebecca wasn't finished, I'd like her to make her point? How can you say, I think that Claire made that idea 20 minutes ago and it didn't get picked up. So I'd really be interested to hear what Claire has to say about it now. If you're a chair, you have certain privileges and maybe then also certain responsibilities to notice the potential for this happening and play an active role in ensuring that people's voices are heard. And maybe even in saying to people who are repeat offenders, look, you may not notice you're doing this, but I have noticed you're doing it and I want you to cut it out. And one last thing, and this is for all of us. So all of us have unconscious bias. I know I've got them. I know you've got them because we live in a particular society where we swallow particular information and it lives unconsciously in our minds. So I also want you to be part of this in acknowledging and thinking about and being mindful of whether there are moments where you're talking over particular people, where you're interrupting particular people, where you're challenging certain people more than others, or dismissing certain people's ideas only for them to be picked up again later. I bet I can think of an instance where I have done all of those things. And if the data's correct, I'll have done them more against women and people who are black and brown. That is not good. That I will have done that. And I know that I will have done that. But it is essential, especially when we're talking about unconscious bias, that we can look at ourselves and be like, I maybe have done that. I probably have done that. Let me be mindful of whether or not I'm subject to that same unconscious bias and therefore behaving in a way that that bias would direct or dictate. Because once we spot it, once we notice it, there is hope. There is hope that we can change any of those patterns that we notice within ourselves. There is hope that we can change those patterns within our organizations, within the meetings that we're in, within the teams that we're in. And there's also hope that we can ally support to other people who may be being subjected to it more or differently than you are. And that if you are the person that this is happening to, that there is support and understanding, at least here and maybe many other places too, for what you're experiencing, how it's making you feel, and support for how you can handle it, because this stuff is not easy. I hope that was useful for you. I realise that I've gone on slightly longer than I intended, but I get very excised about these issues, if you couldn't tell. If you want to come and work with me directly, there are links in the show notes. The easiest thing to do is take the free confidence assessment, which will guide you through a few questions and it will help you to figure out whether or not you're stuck in a low confidence cycle. If you are, you will get some personalized results in your inbox that will talk to you about that low confidence cycle, help you to understand what's going on, and also give you some advice for how you can start getting out of it right away. If you want to come and work with me one-on-one, I am taking on my, very last clients for 2024. So if you want to feel more confident at work, if you've got particular challenges that you want to discuss, that you want to coach on, and you want to overcome, then click the link in the show notes and book a call to explore coaching with me. I'll tell you if I can help you, and I'll also tell you honestly if I can't help you and try and direct you somewhere else where they may be able to. The last place is the Members Club, and this is a membership where you get coaching, training, recorded modules, a private podcast, loads of wraparound support within a group setting and a community to help you move towards feeling more confident at work, because that's what we want. All right, I will see you in next week's episode. Bye.
Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident. Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident at work.